Hello students, today we will discuss about presentation on learning and assessment. System of school education is going through significant changes. Now the focus is on the teaching, rather it has shifted on learning. In a learning center system, it is believed that any normal child can attain high level of achievement if he or she is facilitating conditions for learning. To attain this objective, the traditional competition-based examination doesn't help. Instead, each evaluation assessment practices are to be adopted in which the standards for success are made explicit and all students are expected to reach those standards. In such evaluation, the grading system doesn't grade the students, rather grades performances. There are no grade A students, but there are only grade A performances, and the teacher must teach and assess in ways that motivate all students to succeed. What are then the changing beliefs and processes of learning assessment? Assessment. What is assessment? Assessment is a word that comes from the Latin word assedere, meaning to sit with. In assessment, one should sit with the learner. This implies it is something we do with and for students and not to the students. Assessment is the systematic basis for making inferences about the learning and development of students. It is the process of defining, selecting, designing, collecting, analyzing, interpreting, and using information to increase students' learning and development. From these definitions, we learn about assessment. That assessment is a human activity. Assessment involves interaction which aims at seeking to understand what the learners have achieved. Assessment can be formal or informal. Assessment may be descriptive rather than judgment in nature. Its role is to increase students' learning and development. It helps learners to diagnose their problems and to improve the quality of their subsequent learning. Now we can say that assessment is the engine which drives students' learning. Assessment assists learning. It helps focus effort on the implementing strategies to facilitate learning both inside and outside the classroom. Assessment. In the characteristics of assessment, assessment says congruent with instructions, is based on authentic tasks, use a wide range of tools and methods. Assessment is based on criteria that students know and understand. Assessment is collaborative process involving students. It focuses on what students have learned and can do. It is an outgoing and continuous process. Assessment process. In assessment process, firstly we decide our aims. Then according to aims, we decide actions. Actions decides what part of learning material we should assess, and the result of assessment is adjustment. Importance of assessment. Why assessment is important? To find out what the students know, that is knowledge. To find out what the students can do and how well they can do it. To find out how students go about the task of doing their work. To find out how students feel about their work. What is student assessment for? Student assessment for is to help us design and modify programs to better promote learning and student success, to provide common definitions and benchmarks for student abilities that will enable us to act more coherently and effectively to promote student learning, to provide feedback, guidance and monitoring to students so as to help them better plan and execute their educational programs, to provide improved feedback about student learning, to support faculty in their work. What can be assessed? We can assess students' learning characteristics. In students' learning characteristics, we assess ability differences, learning styles, and in student motivational characteristics, we assess their interest, their self-efficacy, their goal orientation, and in learning, the content knowledge, ability to apply content knowledge, their skills, their dispositions and attitudes, their performances. Functions of assessment. First one is diagnostic. It tells us what the students need to learn. Formative tells us how well the student is doing as work progress. Summative tells us how well the student did at the end of a unit or task. Type of assessment. Assessment for learning, that is called formative assessment. It informs students and teachers. Second one is assessment as learning. It relates to students' metacognition, that is their own creativity. Third one is assessment of learning, that is summative, final, official assessment, that is evaluation of students by teachers. Assessment for learning. What is assessment for learning? Assessment for learning is more commonly known as formative and diagnostic assessments. Assessments for learning is the use of a task or an activity for the purpose of determining student progress during a unit or block of instruction. Teachers are now afforded the chance to adjust classroom instruction based upon the needs of the students. Similarly, students are provided valuable feedback on their own learning. Let us consider this situation. Mr. Rohan, while helping the students of class 4 in adding and subtracting fractions, observed that several students are not able to complete the addition of two improper fractions. He gave a small test with questions from addition of proper fractions. One item of addition of two similar fractions, 3 item from addition of proper and improper fractions, and 4 items from addition of improper fractions. He analyzed the responses of each student and found that nearly 45 of students were not clear in adding proper with improper fractions, which was affecting their performance in adding two improper fractions. He therefore focused on developing the understanding of improper fractions and their addition with proper fractions, after which he proceeded to teach the addition of two improper fractions. In this situation, Mr. Rohan was assessing the performance of students while the teaching learning process was going on. He used the results of assessment for the improvement of learning and his own teaching process. This is a kind of formative assessment and is called assessment for learning. Now, assessment for learning is what? It is the interaction and dialogue between teacher and pupils, help students understand what they need to do next in order to improve, thoughtful improvement rather than getting it right the first time. Now, objectives of assessment for learning. To make every child know how he or she is doing, understand what he or she needs to do to improve and how to get there. The child gets spot, he or she needs to be motivated to become an active learner to continuously improve his or her learning. Second, to equip every teacher to make well-founded judgments about students' attainment, understand the concepts and principles of progression, and know how to use their assessment results to plan for improvement of learning of each student, particularly of those who are not fulfilling their potential. Phases of assessment for learning. Assessment for learning comprises of two phases. First one is initial or diagnostic assessment, and the second one is formative assessment. Diagnostic assessment is assessment made before the learning of a unit. Commences in order to determine what a student does and doesn't know about a topic. This form assessment helps us to identify where your students are in their learning and what course of action appropriate to the learning levels of the students are needed to be taken for continuing or improving their learning. For example, if you are planning to teach the different states of India in class 6th, You need to know whether the students are well conversant in using the atlas. If you find most of the students in the class know how to use an atlas, you can engage majority of class in working on an application of using atlas, while you can work with a small group on how to use an atlas. Second one is formative assessment. Formative assessment is an assessment through which you can gather data during the learning process. When the class progresses through a unit of a study to determine a student's knowledge and skills, including learning gaps. You can see the results of formative assessment to guide learning and make timely change in your teaching strategy to suit the needs of your students. Considering the example of using Atlas, you can provide feedback about the work the students have completed using the Atlas and provide ideas for adjusting, rethinking, and articulating their learning. Characteristics of assessment for learning. Now we discuss about the characteristics of assessment for learning. It is responsive to all learners by identifying areas of strength and need of each and every student. It is descriptive in nature and is not judgmental and hence not evaluative. Through the use of high quality feedback, it informs students about what they have done well, where they have had difficulty, and what they need to do differently to improve their work. Since the learner has to be provided feedback in order to improve the ongoing process of learning, the assessment is frequent and continuous in the learning process. It causes students to reflect upon their work and learning and take specific actions to improve them. It expects students to make error and directs them to examine these errors in order to improve their learning. It involves students in structured self and peer examination of their work. It is planned and used in ways that it provides support to sustain students' learning so that ultimately they can demonstrate improved performance in the assessment of learning that will be used for grading and reporting purposes. Principles of assessment for learning. The UK Assessment Reform Group in 1999 identifies the big 5 principles of assessment for learning, which are: first, the provision of effective feedback to students, the active involvement of students in their own learning, adjusting teaching to take account of the results of assessment. Approaches and methods of assessment for learning. There are mainly 4 approaches of carrying out. First one is teacher-led assessment, that is using a wide range of methods like written or verbal, testing interactions with students, assignments, observation of students, activities, etc. Second one, learners' self-assessment, that is self-reflection on own performance and on others' judgments. Third one is peer assessment, which deals with assessment of classmates on the response and performance of the learner. And the last one is computer-based assessment using specially designed software. Assessment for learning in the classroom. The 7 strategies of assessment for learning. First, where am I going? That is, firstly, provide students with a clear and understandable vision of the learning target. Second, use examples and models of strong and weak work. Third strategy includes in where am I now? That is, offer regular descriptive feedback and teach students to self-assess and set goals. And the next category deals with how can I close the gap? That is, design lessons to focus on one learning target or aspect of quality at a time, and teach students focused revision, engage students in self-reflection, and let them keep track of and share their learning. Feedback on assessment for learning. The main purpose of an assessment for learning is to provide feedback to both the teachers and student regarding the student's progress towards achieving the learning objectives. This feedback should be used by the teacher to revise and develop further instruction. Giving constructive feedback, that is verbal and written, is a vital aspect of assessment for learning. While providing feedback to students, following points need to be taken care of. While giving written feedback, respond to the content and the message in the writing fast. Don't focus only on surface errors such as spelling or punctuation. Don't jump straight to the errors. Brace fast. Be specific. Indicate what action the student should take in relation to weakness that have been marked. Encourage the student to make corrections. Don't simply write the correct answers, spellings, and so on. When giving verbal feedback, stress the positive. Always give specific feedback on what a student has done well. Celebrate what's been achieved and be clear about exactly what needs to improve next and how. Use prompts such as, "Would you like to say more about that?" Focus on things that each student can change and avoid overloading them with too much feedback at once. For effective feedback, given either verbally or in writing to student performances, you need to take care of the following points. First one is, provide the feedback without any delay, otherwise the feedback may lose its relevance. Use accurate, descriptive statements instead of marks with a will to help students develop independent learning habits. Include statements of strength and weaknesses of a student and guide on how to improve. Provide 1 or 2 learning goals or targets which can be achieved by the students as next steps. Now the second is assessment as learning. Assessment as learning focuses on students and emphasizes assessment as a process of metacognition, that is, knowledge of one's own thought process. For students, assessment as learning emerges from the idea that learning is not just a matter of transferring ideas from someone who is knowledge to someone who is not, but is an active process of cognitive restructuring that occurs when individuals interact with new ideas. Within this view of learning, students are the critical connectors between assessment and learning. For students to be actively engaged in creating their own understanding, they must learn to be critical assessors who make sense of information related to prior knowledge and use it for new learning. This is the regulatory process in metacognition. That is, students become adept at personally monitoring what they are learning and use what they discover from the monitoring to make adjustments, adaptations, and even major changes in their thinking. Definitions of assessment as learning. Assessment as learning is based on the conviction that the students are capable of being adaptable, flexible, and independent in their learning and decision making. Let us consider this situation. Mr. Ananta, a student of class 7th, was collecting all his work in a portfolio for presenting it for assessment by teacher and his classmates. While assembling and arranging the work in a proper order, he tried to list the indicators of the portfolio assessment. He was thoughtful of how to arrange this material so that to attract the attention of the teacher and classmates who would assess his portfolio. He came up with a plan. He developed a storyline and prepared some additional posters depicting the storyline, and within it, he arranged the products in such a way that the observer following the storyline could neither afford to miss any work of Miss Ananta nor could consider any material to be irrelevant in the total collection. Let us reflect what Miss Ananta was doing. First, he was trying to arrange the collection of his products for assessment. He listed the pointers of assessment, that is learning outcomes. He developed some new materials he thought as required for assessment. He tried to arrange but found the products to be quite incongruent. He thought to have a way for a meaningful arrangement, and he struck upon a storyline and then completed the arrangement. All the while, Ananta was preparing for an assessment event, and at the same time, he was assessing himself and his materials, that is, their adequacy, their relevance, and meaningfulness so far as learning outcomes, that is, indicators of assessment, were concerned. Assessment as learning provides a variety of opportunities for the student to reflect on his or her learning through the process of metacognition. This can be facilitated through brainstorming, group discussion, collaborative learning, situations, and through the peer and self-assessment. Self-assessment helps students to reflect on their own learning, identify their strengths and areas where they need to improve using clear criteria related to the expectations and achievement levels, set goals, and identify next step for learning. Develop skills in metacognition. They become independent, self-directed students, select work for their portfolios that represent their progress and best efforts over time. Now, second one is peer assessment, in which way it helps to consolidate their learning through dialogue and interaction with their peers. Learn how to give and receive constructive explicit feedback based on clear criteria. Practice the concept and skills explicitly modeled and taught through activities or tasks. And the third one is assessment of learning. And what is assessment of learning is? Assessment of learning is the use of a task or an activity to measure, record, and report on a student's level of achievement in regards to specific learning expectations. These are often known as summative assessments. Assessment of learning is which enables students to demonstrate what they know and can do. Describes the extent to which a student has achieved the learning goals, including the standards. Uses teacher judgments about student achievement at a point in time. Assessment is supported by examples or evidence of student learning. It ensures consistent teacher judgment through modernization processes and is used to plan future learning goals. In guiding principles, assessment of learning is an integral part of the teaching learning process. As we know, assessment is a tool which should match the performance objectives. The result of assessment must be feedback to the learners. In assessing learning, teacher must consider learners' learning style and multiple intelligences, and so must come up with variety of ways of assessing learning. Emphasize on self-assessment. Assessment of learning should never be used as punishment or as a disciplinary measure. Result of learning assessment must be communicated regularly and clearly to parents. Emphasize on real-world application that favors realistic performances over out-of-context drill items. To contribute to the building of the culture of success in the school, it is pedagogically sound that in our assessment techniques, we give some positive feedback along with not so good ones. What is the difference between assessment of learning, that is summative assessment, and assessment for learning, which is formative assessment? When the cook tastes the soup, that is formative assessment. And when the customer tastes the soup, this is summative assessment. According to the base of primary user, assessment of learning is used by policymakers, program planners, and supervisors, while the assessment for learning is used by students, teachers, and parents. Teachers' role in assessment of learning is to follow test administration procedures, use results to help students reach GPS. And in assessment for learning, the role of teacher is to inform students of targets, modify instructions, and involve students in assessment. Students' role in assessment of learning is to study to meet standards, take the best, strive for the highest score possible, and avoid failure. And an assessment for learning, the role of student is strive to understand the target, act on classroom assessment to improve, encourage success. Let us sum up. And the assessment of learning is determine students' background knowledge and skills, that is track student progress in understanding. What is assessment as learning? Assessment as learning in which the student reflects on result of assessment chart, his or her own progress, and plans next step to improve performance, builds metacognition as it involves the student in setting and monitoring on learning goals. And the last one is assessment of learning, which purpose is being summative. It measures students' attainment of standards. Thank you.